The summer afternoon cast long shadows over the stone-paved grounds of Buckingham Palace, drenching the entire scene in the golden glow of sunset. Tourists gathered in small groups, cameras raised high, eyes fixed on the royal guards, living statues standing motionless amid the bustling crowd. Yet no one, not a single soul, could foresee that in just a few moments, this solemn tranquility would be torn apart by an unforgiving confrontation between privilege and discipline, between arrogance and unwavering resolve. Charlotte Dawson, her golden hair meticulously styled, strode through the crowd as if the entire place had been built solely for her. An expensive linen dress hugged her elegant frame, her high heels striking the stone pavement with crisp, authoritative beats, each step a proclamation of power. Her designer handbag glistened under the sunlight, swaying ever so slightly with each movement of her arm, like an invisible scepter with which she commanded the world. People like Charlotte did not stroll. They paraded. She halted, her sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd before flicking toward the guards in their striking red uniforms. They stood there, motionless like statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead, entirely indifferent to her presence. A flicker of irritation flashed in Charlotte's eyes. She was accustomed to people bowing before her. Waiters, hotel staff, subordinates, even executives within her industry, all of them listened. All of them reacted to her presence. But this soldier, he dared to ignore her? Ethan Turner, a royal guard standing as straight as a drawn sword, remained utterly unmoved. His gaze was steadfast, locked onto a point trained into him through years of discipline. Every feature of his face was chiseled like marble, revealing not the slightest hint of emotion. Beneath the scorching sun, his uniform remained impeccable, each brass button gleaming, every fold in his jacket unblemished. He was a symbol of discipline, of an unshakable will. But to Charlotte, this was not steadfastness, it was defiance. A silent rage began to simmer within her. His silence was nothing less than a slap to Charlotte Dawson's pride. She was not accustomed to being overlooked. She did not tolerate indifference from someone she deemed to be just a gatekeeper. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag, crimson-painted nails digging into the fine leather. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing like a predator locking onto its prey. If this soldier thought he could remain still without consequence, he was mistaken. Charlotte Dawson took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders with pride. She was not the kind of person to be taken lightly. It had taken her decades to build her reputation in the business world, a powerful businesswoman, someone who could command attention with just a single sentence. Where Charlotte Dawson was, attention followed. And now, this guard had the audacity to ignore her? A flicker of irritation seeped into her every cell, spreading through her body like a slow-burning fire. Her eyes swept across the people around her. They were watching, observing, waiting to see what would happen. Some gazes were scrutinizing, others wary. A mother pulled her child close, whispering something in its ear. An elderly couple shook their heads, their eyes flashing with concern. But that only made Charlotte more determined. She stepped forward, her heels striking against the stone floor like the rhythmic beat of a war drum. She stood directly in front of Ethan Turner, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his heavy uniform. Tilting her head slightly, she curved her lips into a sharp smile. "Excuse me, am I interrupting something?" No response. No eye contact, no movement. This silence, to Charlotte, was not just disrespect. It was an insult. Ethan Turner remained where he stood, as still as a marble statue. Military discipline had forged him into a man of steel, someone who would not be provoked easily. He had stood in war zones riddled with gunfire, watched comrades fall, held his ground as the enemy closed in. A wealthy woman, dripping with the arrogance of the elite? She was no threat. She was just a passing wind, incapable of shaking a warrior. But Charlotte did not see it that way. She locked eyes with him, eyes that remained unshaken, and she hated it. "Do you think you can just stand there and ignore me?" Her voice rose slightly, sharper now, like a blade freshly honed. Still no response. The crowd began to shift, a few people quietly stepping back, sensing the tension rising in the air. "I am talking to you, soldier." Charlotte's voice rang out, her patience fraying to its limits. She had commanded CEOs, made employees grovel at her feet for the slightest mistake, crushed careers with a single whisper of her influence. And now, a man in a cheap uniform thought he could treat her as if she were invisible? Unacceptable. She stepped even closer, the space between them reduced to mere inches. Ethan could smell the faint trace of expensive perfume in the air, but he did not move. "You are looking at me, aren't you?" "I saw it. Do not pretend." A woman in the crowd inhaled sharply, placing a hand over her chest as if she could not believe what was unfolding. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, why is she so angry?" But Charlotte did not care about them. She cared about only one thing, regaining control. Ethan sensed the threat in her tone, yet he remained unmoving. He had encountered people like Charlotte before, those who believed they could bend the world to their will, those who had never truly faced hardship. Yet, despite everything, something felt off. This was not just a clash between a stubborn woman and a guard. There was something deeper. Charlotte was not just angry. She was searching for something. Recognition? Victory? Or just confirmation that she still held power? Ethan had met people like her in the military, those who constantly sought control, who imposed their will on others. And when they failed to achieve it, they became dangerous. A voice suddenly cut through Ethan's thoughts. "You should stop." Marcus Ellis, a veteran who had seen too many conflicts in his lifetime, stepped out from the crowd. His face bore the deep lines of time, but his eyes remained as sharp as they had been on the battlefield. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." Charlotte paused for a second, her gaze flickering to Marcus before curling her lips into a smirk. "And who are you? An old man with dusty medals?" Marcus did not answer immediately. He simply looked at her with the eyes of a man who had seen things Charlotte would never understand: death, sacrifice, loyalty, and the lessons paid for in blood. "I am someone who fought so you could stand here and say those words." A heavy silence hung in the air, but Charlotte only scoffed. She did not care about men who called themselves soldiers. "Then let me show you how strong I am." She reached in her handbag. Ethan recognized the movement instantly. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring wound tight. Marcus narrowed his eyes. The crowd held its breath. Charlotte pulled out a small object, metal glinting under the sun. A can of pepper spray. A breeze swept gently across the stone-paved square in front of Buckingham Palace, carrying the lingering heat of a summer afternoon. Yet the air had turned eerily cold. Every movement seemed to slow, time itself suspended in the moment Charlotte Dawson pulled a canister of pepper spray from her handbag. The polished metal gleamed under the sunlight, flashing like a blade poised to sever the heavy silence between her and the guardsman. Ethan Turner did not move. Not because he failed to sense the threat, but because he had been trained not to react instinctively in high-pressure situations. One wrong move could escalate the situation instantly, and he could not allow that, at least not before he was certain of Charlotte's intentions. But her eyes left no room for doubt. What had started as frustration had hardened into genuine fury. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the canister, her long nails digging into the metal casing. She was no longer just an overlooked woman. She was a challenged one, and that made her determined to reclaim control at any cost. Marcus Ellis, the old veteran, clenched his fists silently. He had seen that look before, not from an upper-class woman in the heart of London, but from men on the battlefield, when fear and failure drove people to their most reckless decisions. "You do not want to do this," he said, his voice low but firm, each word weighted with experience. Charlotte glanced at Marcus, her lips curling into a mocking smirk. "Do you think I am afraid? I have brought men to their knees with a single phone call. I know how to make people pay." "But this time, you have chosen the wrong target," Marcus countered, his gaze sharp as a blade cutting straight through her. The crowd was silent. Some quietly stepped back, gripping their children's hands. Others raised their phones, realizing they were about to witness something destined for viral fame. Charlotte turned back to face Ethan. He remained motionless, his expression unreadable, and that infuriated her. "You think you are strong, do you?" she hissed, stepping closer, so close she could hear the steady rhythm of his breath. No response. Charlotte's fury exploded. "I have dealt with men like you my entire life. Men who think they hold power just because they wear a ridiculous uniform. You stand here, believing you can make me invisible? I will teach you a lesson about real power." She raised the canister, finger poised over the trigger, her eyes alight with a twisted certainty that she was about to restore the order she believed had been broken. Marcus stepped forward, but it was too late. A sharp hiss sliced through the air. A stream of pepper spray shot directly into Ethan's face. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. A child wailed as their mother yanked them back, away from the unfolding scene. But as they all braced for a reaction, a cry of pain, a flinch, a recoil, the soldier remained still. No blinking, no grimace, no sound. Ethan Turner, his face dripping with a burning liquid, stood as though nothing had happened. Charlotte hesitated. The moment stretched unnaturally long, as the cracks in her arrogance began to form. "Impossible," she muttered, her grip on the canister loosening. It slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the stone ground with a sharp metallic ring. Marcus inhaled slowly. He had seen soldiers like Ethan before, men who had endured things Charlotte could never even begin to fathom. Ethan's face was slick with the stinging chemical, but his eyes remained open, steady, unwavering. And then, for the first time, he moved. Ethan slowly turned his head, his gaze, neither angry nor pained, but calm and commanding, locking onto Charlotte. That look was not punishment. It was a statement. "You thought this would break me?" Ethan's voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of countless hours of training and real battles. Charlotte took a step back. Ethan inhaled, his breathing controlled, though his eyes were bloodshot from the chemical burn. "I have stood in the line of fire to protect civilians. I have lost brothers in battles you could not even find on a map." Each word landed like a hammer against the foundation of Charlotte's arrogance. "You cannot break me." Charlotte opened her mouth, searching for something to say, but no words came out. All she could do was retreat. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, a voice rose from the crowd. Not loud, but enough to shatter the silence. "He is a real soldier." Marcus Ellis looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with respect. And Charlotte? She had begun to realize she had made the worst mistake of her life. Silence enveloped Buckingham Square. Not the pleasant silence of a tranquil summer afternoon, but a heavy, taut stillness like a drawn bowstring, where everyone held their breath at what had just transpired. Charlotte Dawson took a step back, her high heels clicking uncertainly against the stone pavement. That was impossible. She had seen enough men submit before her, CEOs, subordinates, even rivals in cutthroat business deals. A single raised eyebrow, a sharp remark, a cold slap of power and influence, and they all yielded. But this soldier, Ethan Turner, stood his ground like an unshakable fortress, even as his eyes burned red from the chemical, even as chemical-induced tears streamed down his cheeks, soaking into the deep red of his uniform. Nobody mafe, no retreat. Not a single sign that he was affected by the assault Charlotte had believed would bring him to his knees. She had never seen anyone like him, and that terrified her. For the first time in her life, Charlotte felt something she dared not name: powerlessness. She swallowed dryly, her hands clenching instinctively, but there was nothing left to hold on to. The pepper spray canister lay uselessly at her feet, just as useless as the power she had always believed she possessed. Marcus Ellis stepped forward beside Ethan, his gaze filled with admiration. Deep down, he knew Ethan was no ordinary soldier. It was not just discipline, not just training. It was fortitude. "Are you all right, son?" His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of years spent on the battlefield. Ethan blinked once, just once, as if to push back the burning pain in his eyes. But when he opened them again, his gaze remained the same, cold as steel, unwavering, unshaken. "I am still standing, sir." Marcus gave a slight nod, a silent show of respect between soldiers. He had trained young men to become warriors, but few could hold their composure like this. Ethan Turner was not just a soldier. He was a bastion of resilience. But Charlotte? She was crumbling. She looked at Ethan, into his eyes, not angry, not vengeful, only calm and unyielding, and she realized something terrifying. She had no power here. Not like in the boardrooms where her reputation alone could dominate. Not like in the high-end restaurants where a mere glance could send waiters scrambling in fear. Here in front of the soldiers, she was nothing. Her throat went dry. The crowd was still watching. But they were not looking at Ethan with pity. They looked at him with respect. And the way they looked at Charlotte? Contempt. A foreign sensation welled up in her chest. A feeling she had not experienced in years. Shame. You thought you could break me with pepper spray? Ethan's voice cut through the air, slow, but carrying the weight of command. Charlotte froze. You do not understand, do you? He continued, stepping forward, not in threat, not in aggression, but with the quiet power of a man who had faced horrors 100 times worse. She could not move. You think a royal guard stands here just for show? Do you know how many soldiers have worn this uniform before me? Ethan reached up and brushed his fingers over the medals on his chest. They did not just stand in front of this palace. They fought in Normandy, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. They bled to defend this country. And you think you can make one of us bow with a can of pepper spray? Charlotte opened her mouth, but no words came out. I have stood in the line of fire to protect civilians. I have watched my comrades fall. You have no idea what real strength is, Dawson. Her name rang out like a verdict. Marcus slowly nodded, his voice as deep as distant thunder. Do you know why he did not react, Dawson? Charlotte swallowed hard. Because he has been trained to never bow to fear. And you? Marcus's lips curled into a cold smile. You are the most frightened person here. Charlotte felt the air around her closing in, suffocating her. She looked around, the crowd, their eyes, the shame spreading through every inch of her being. And then, the sound that shattered the tense silence. The whistle of the police. Flashing blue and red lights reflected against the stone pavement. 2 uniformed officers approached, their eyes scanning the scene before them. A guardsman assaulted, a wealthy woman standing there, her face pale. One of the officers, his voice firm, spoke up. What happened here? Marcus crossed his arms, tilting his head towards Charlotte. I think she can explain that herself. Charlotte opened her mouth to speak, but once again, no words came. And then, Ethan turned to face her. You wanted to teach me a lesson about power? He said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. A heavy silence stretched between them. You chose the wrong man. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte Dawson understood that she had lost. The siren of the police car blared, sharp as a blade cutting through the tense, suffocating air. The flashing red and green lights reflected off Ethan Turner's chemically stained uniform, onto Charlotte Dawson's pale face, and onto the eyes of the onlookers, filled with a mix of astonishment and fury from those present at Buckingham Square. 2 police officers approached, their faces stern, eyes sweeping across the scene like cold razor blades. One was tall, with graying hair, clearly experienced. The other was younger, perhaps new to the force, but his eyes were still sharp, missing no details. What is happening here? Silence fell. Charlotte opened her mouth, but this time, no words came out. Her throat felt dry, her lips lost the usual confidence she carried. She was far too accustomed to situations she could control. Powerful parties, negotiations where she was always the one setting the terms, lavish offices where she could make someone lose their job with a mere snap of her fingers. But here, among the hundreds of eyes watching, in front of a soldier standing like a statue, so steadfast that even pain couldn't make him waver, she had no power. We have a report of a pepper spray attack. The older officer continued, his voice carrying the sharpness of one who had witnessed far too many think they were above the law. Charlotte suddenly felt like the world was closing in around her. She glanced at the crowd, where dozens of people were still filming with their phones. They had seen everything. They had seen her attack a royal guard. They had seen the pepper spray shoot directly into his face. They had seen him stand firm like a fortress, unyielding, unshaken. And they had also seen her, Charlotte Dawson, the powerful woman everyone feared, step back, trembling like a defeated person. She inhaled, trying to steady her voice. It was just a misunderstanding, but even as she spoke, she knew no one would believe her. Marcus Ellis chuckled softly, a sound full of sarcasm, the experience of someone who had seen too many like Charlotte in his life. A misunderstanding? I think the whole square just witnessed exactly what happened, madam. Charlotte clenched her hands, her fingers digging into her palm until it nearly drew blood. No, she couldn't let it end this way. I was just defending myself. He looked at me inappropriately. I felt threatened. But this time, even she didn't believe her own excuse. Her voice trembled, no longer carrying the cold, authoritative tone it usually had. Ethan Turner finally spoke, his voice low but carrying, like the distant sound of a war drum from the battlefield. You felt threatened? By a soldier standing still? Charlotte shuddered. You think I was looking at you? Do you know what I was looking at? Ethan slowly pointed toward the palace gate, where a small bronze plaque was affixed to the wall. The memorial. Charlotte blinked. What? Ethan continued, his voice no longer just cold. Now it carried the weight of centuries of history and sacrifice. Every royal guard is trained to focus on a fixed point. And that point, madam, is that memorial over there, the one inscribed with the names of those who fell to protect the freedom you are now abusing. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Ethan took a small step forward, but it was not threatening, not menacing, just an absolute respect, the calm of a true warrior. You think I was looking at you? No, I was looking at those who sacrificed so that you could stand here, arrogant, abusing your power, thinking you can do whatever you want without consequences. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. No, it couldn't be. She couldn't be the one in the wrong here. But as she looked around, into the eyes of the crowd, into the respect people had for the soldier before her, she knew she had lost. And this time, no one was coming to save her. The older police officer cleared his throat. Charlotte Dawson, you are under arrest for assaulting a royal officer in the line of duty. You have the right to remain silent. Charlotte froze. Her hands were pulled behind her back, the cold metal cuffs locking around her wrists, a reminder that she had lost everything. Marcus Ellis nodded slightly at Ethan, his eyes showing deep respect. Boy, you did well. Ethan said nothing. He just closed his eyes briefly, feeling the lingering sting on his face. But in his heart, there was no bitterness. Because he knew this wasn't just a personal confrontation. This was a lesson. Charlotte Dawson, the woman who once thought power could control everything, had just learned a bitter lesson. True power does not lie in threats, not in privilege, not in fame. True power lies in perseverance, in loyalty, and in an indomitable will. Charlotte Dawson walked forward, her hands cuffed behind her back, each step unsteady as if the weight of what had just transpired was pressing down heavily on her shoulders. All eyes were on her, not the familiar gazes of fear or admiration, but the looks of disdain, disappointment, and even pity. With every step she took, the rhythm of her high heels striking the stone floor no longer carried the echo of power, but only the hollow sound of failure. How did this happen? Why her? The one who always controlled the situation, the one who always made others submit. Why was she the one being led away like a criminal? Her hands clenched instinctively, but this time, nothing was within her control anymore. Ethan Turner stood still, watching her, his gaze devoid of any triumph or gloating. For him, this was not a victory. It was a lesson, not just for Charlotte, but for all those who had witnessed it. Marcus Ellis stood beside him, arms crossed, observing with a thoughtful expression. He had seen too many people like Charlotte in his life. Those who thought power came from imposing their will on others. Those who believed they could control the world with nothing but reputation and status. But those people, when faced with harsh reality, were always the first to fall. A gentle breeze passed by, carrying a hint of coolness from the evening air. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the wind against his face, still stinging from the chemicals. He did not think about the pain. He thought about what had just occurred. Not everyone could understand the true meaning of this uniform. Not everyone realized that, in order to enjoy the peace they were living, some had to sacrifice their lives, their blood, and their tears. But today, a woman like Charlotte Dawson had learned that, and Ethan knew she would never forget. Charlotte was shoved into the police car. The door slammed shut behind her with a dull thud, like the final blow to the illusion of power she had built for so long. She no longer resisted. There were no more excuses, no more arrogant looks. She simply sat there, her wide eyes staring into the empty space before her, as if finally realizing what she had done. The sound of the siren shattered the silence. As the car drove away from the square, Charlotte suddenly realized this was the first time in her life that she no longer controlled her fate. And that was what terrified her more than anything. Ethan still stood there, as unmoving as a bronze statue carved through time. The sting of the chemicals had dried on his face, leaving faint marks on his sun-kissed skin. But he did not move. He knew this was his duty, not just to protect the palace, but to uphold the values this uniform represented: loyalty, honor, and determination. Marcus Ellis turned to Ethan, his gaze full of genuine respect. "Do you know, young man?" Marcus said, his voice warm but weighted. "I've fought on many battlefields, but I've rarely seen a soldier maintain discipline like you." Ethan nodded slightly, saying nothing, because he didn't need to speak. Everyone around them had already seen it. They had witnessed the resilience of a royal guard, the courage that needed no force, and they had come to understand that true strength does not lie in attack, but in the ability to endure challenges. The sun was slowly setting behind the historic buildings of London, coloring the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The last rays of light reflected off the medals on Ethan Turner's chest, making them shine like fragments of the memories of the soldiers who had stood in this place before him. The square in front of Buckingham Palace had now emptied of the crowd, but the atmosphere still lingered with the echoes of an event that no one could easily forget. A soldier had stood firm. A proud man had been brought down, not by violence, but by the very resilience of that soldier. Ethan did not move. He stood there, as still as a monument to loyalty and discipline. But deep inside, he knew that everything had changed. Not for him, but for everyone who had witnessed it. In the distance, Marcus Ellis had not yet left. He stood quietly, watching Ethan, then gazing in the direction of the police car that had taken Charlotte Dawson away. A brief smile appeared on his face. Not a smile of triumph, but the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice done in the most deserving way. Marcus understood that Ethan was not just a soldier doing his duty. He had become a living lesson. The young boy, who had been standing next to his mother, was still watching Ethan. He gripped his mother's sleeve tightly, his eyes gleaming with admiration. "Mom, when I grow up, can I be as strong as him?" The mother gently bent down, brushing her son's hair, her voice soft but resolute. "Not just strong, son. You must also know how to stand firm against what is wrong." The boy pursed his lips and clenched his small fist, as if silently promising himself something. Ethan did not hear those words, but he did not need to, because what he had done today would resonate for a long time in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Charlotte Dawson's story is not just about a woman being arrested for her misdeeds. It is the story of how people misjudge strength. Charlotte believed that power was the ability to make others submit. She believed that control was the measure of strength, that threats and privilege could break anyone. But she was wrong. Strength does not lie in arrogance. It does not lie in making others fearful. True strength is the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. It is the steadfastness in morality and honor. It is maintaining dignity even when attacked. Ethan Turner did not fight. He did not need to fight, because true strength does not require violence to prove itself. It only needs to exist, and when it exists, it is enough to defeat everything that is false. Charlotte Dawson, with all her power, fame, and privilege, was defeated not by fists, but by the steadfastness of a soldier. That is the lesson, not just for Charlotte, but for all of us. Life will always have people like Charlotte Dawson, those who believe they can threaten, control, and overwhelm others with their power. But there will always be people like Ethan Turner, those who understand that strength does not lie in domination, but in resolve. Those who do not need to raise their voices, do not need to use violence. They only need to stand firm, and their presence is enough. Today, a soldier taught us that. And what about you? Who will you be when faced with a challenge? Will you be someone who easily succumbs to pressure, or will you stand firm in the face of every storm? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has touched you, like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue following stories of resolve, honor, and true strength.